Puzzles and puzzle games have a reputation for being the sort of thing you pick up when you want something to engage your brain but relax at the same time. Piecing something together can be rewarding, and it's generally low stakes enough that it won't drive you to pull out your own hair. Of course, there are some times you'll pick up a puzzler that looks as charming as can be, but soon it becomes clear that you've signed up for something much more difficult than you originally hoped, going from something you can easily solve on a bus ride to equations that require a university degree with little warning. So today, we're here to give you a list of the games that are full of difficult puzzles to twist your brain, just in case you have a strong desire to give yourself a migraine. Some are infamous, while others are lesser known, but no less tricky. And regardless, unless you have a galaxy brain or a handy walkthrough at the ready, they're all sure to trip you up at some point. I'm Ashton from TripleJump, and here are the 10 most difficult puzzle games of all time. Number 10. Stephen's Sausage Roll. Cooking food can be stressful enough on its own, even if you enjoy doing it. There are so many places it can go wrong, especially if you're trying to follow a recipe and end up reading it wrong 3 times because the writer is going on about her life in between each step. Now, imagine you're making lunch, but you have to use each of the ingredients to solve a puzzle while you're doing it. This is the general premise that Stephen's Sausage Roll operates on, requiring players to move around the grid-based world as they attempt to cook their sausages and avoid spoiling them in any way. It's not just overcooking that's a danger here, as the food is just as likely to roll off the side of the stage and into the water, which will cause a reset as well. This can get even more complicated when there's more than one sausage to take care of, especially if there's a situation where one gets stuck burning on the grill before the other is anywhere near being edible. The next time you're struggling to make your dinner, just be grateful you don't have to play Tetris with it at the same time. Number 9. Unheard. Mostly, when you think about puzzle games, there's generally a strong emphasis on some sort of visual component. Unheard, or Unheard Voices of Crime if you want to get full title about this, takes a different approach. Because despite the name, it's completely based on interpreting and analysing audio samples in order to solve a mystery. Players take on the role of a newly appointed acoustic detective, who has been called in to test a new technology that allows them to analyse every conversation that every person at the scene of the crime has heard. By rewinding, listening and analysing each of the conversations in each scene, and following each suspect and seeing what they get up to, players will be able to sort out which voice belongs to whom, what their relationships are, and, hopefully, which one of them is ultimately to blame for the crime. They also have to be sure to pay attention to tone of voice and subtle nuances, determining whether any indications of stress and the like are genuine or just the signs of a really good faker. When even the smallest little audio clip could mean the difference between solving a crime correctly or not, there are few games that test players' skills quite like Unheard. Number 8. Snakebird. Despite looking like a strange hybrid of Angry Birds and Snake Pass, Snakebird doesn't take after either of these much, and instead is more like the classic Nokia game Snake. It is, however, much more complicated than any of those other games are, and will trip you up sooner than you think. The goal of each level is to guide the snakebirds to all of the fruit, and then to the end of the level. Each food will make the creature grow by 1 block, which will make them able to reach higher or further platforms, but at the same time will mean they can more easily get stuck in an area that is too small for them to maneuver out of properly. As players make their way through more and more levels, they'll also have to take into account different movable blocks and platforms, teleporters, and other complications which can easily mess with their carefully laid puzzle plans if they aren't careful. It is, overall, probably much shorter than many of the other puzzle games that can be found on this list, but that doesn't mean it's any less mind-boggling over its short runtime. Number 7. Myst. Imagine a time way back in the distant past when the internet wasn't readily available and game walkthroughs were physical books you had to pick up from a real shop, if they existed at all. This is the world that Myst was released into, expecting its players to sort out all the complex enigmas for themselves, by exploring the titular island and its connected ages, relying on nothing more than their own wits to unravel the mysteries. The thing about it is that, unlike most of the confusing point and clicks of the time, Myst's puzzles were at least solvable, and did not fall victim to the absolutely insane moon logic that most of them tended to have. That's not to say they were easy, of course, often relying on a good memory or constant note-taking in order to remember solutions for puzzles that may not show up for ages. But at least all the solutions were somewhere in the game, waiting to be found. Myst was an incredible success, becoming the best-selling PC game of all time until The Sims finally managed to overtake it almost a decade later. If you're willing to buy a journal solely for the purpose of one game, assuming you aren't cheekily using a walkthrough as you play, there is no shortage of complex brain teasers in this title, or in any of its sequels. Number 6, Baba Is You. Games don't always need to go all out with their puzzles as much as Myst does to be difficult though. Take, for example, the deceptively complex Baba Is You, that hides much more depth than its simple aesthetic implies. You would think that such a seemingly simple and finite combination of words wouldn't cause all that much stress, but some of the puzzles require quite a bit of abstract thinking, and can be especially difficult to wrap your head around if you're not used to computer language and coding. Because, at its core, that's what the logic behind the game's many puzzles boils down to: coding. It starts very simply, by allowing basic conditional statements that allow Baba to interact with the world and objects in it, and potentially even become something else entirely, all depending on where the player has placed the words. It's very possible to write yourself into a corner with this one, by putting the wrong combination of things together in such a way that it becomes impossible to reach the goal, or to add more steps to something that may be much simpler to achieve. Baba Is You? Ha! More like Baba is through with this confusing nonsense. Got him. Number 5, the Talos Principle. Puzzle games often can function without much of a story, or have one that only loosely outlines what's going on in the game. Not so with the Talos Principle, which assaults your brain with both complex riddles and high-level philosophical debates at the same time, to really keep you on your toes. Most of the puzzles found in the game need to be solved to collect different blocks, which act as sigils and will be used to unlock more puzzle areas, leading to more blocks, and so on. These also need to be solved, preferably without the player getting killed by the drones and wall-mounted turrets, which will take them out and reset their progress with that particular puzzle in one fell swoop. To make sure that things never get too simple and repetitive, the Talos Principle eventually brings in multiple devices and useful items, such as boxes, fans, and even a clone, that all have to be used in tandem in order to solve the many puzzles that are found throughout. The second of the games can also be mind-bending, introducing a load of new mechanics and puzzle types to make sure that it's everything the first game was and more. Regardless of which you choose, you're sure to have a fun but tricky time with either one of these existential titles. Number 4, Opus Magnum. A lot of the time, the difficulty with puzzle games can come from the fact that the developers only thought of one way to solve a particular problem, or failing this, programmed only a single approach to a given challenge as the correct one. If you're looking for something a little more freeform, while still providing an ample challenge, on the other hand, Opus Magnum will allow you to flex your brain muscles and show off just how creative you can be with your solutions. That doesn't necessarily make things any easier though, and figuring out the combinations the transmutation machine can use in order to concoct the various potions, poisons, weapons, and more that are needed will take a lot of brain power, even right at the start of the game. Part programming, part problem solving, Opus Magnum is definitely not for the faint of heart, because honestly, even just looking at it starts to make my eyes go a bit funny. If you and your friends are puzzle fiends though, you can show off your creations to each other and argue about which one of you did it best. I'm sure that'll be a fun time all round. Number 3, Deadly Rooms of Death. You'd think that cleaning up a dungeon would be a fairly straightforward task, especially since they're not known for their cleanliness. Turns out, however, that it's more complex than it sounds. In Deadly Rooms of Death, Players guide Smite Master Beathrow Budkin through a series of dungeon rooms, and in each of them he has to take out all the enemies with his really big sword in order to clean the place up. Every movement Beathrow takes is considered to be a turn, from actual turning to stepping between tiles, and the enemies will also advance in turns, making their way towards him in equal reactive measure. These aren't the only hazards that he'll run into throughout the course of the game though, as later rooms will introduce traps and obstacles or special items that have to be activated in order to open various doors. And then, on top of this, as if the levels in the actual game aren't bad enough, players can make things even worse for themselves by seeking out any number of user-created death traps that very likely led to broken monitors back in the day. I reckon that makes this one perfect for anyone who enjoyed the frustration of Super Mario Maker. Number 2, The Witness. Let's leave all the fighting behind for now though, shall we? The imminent threat of attack can add an extra layer of stress to things, so instead we'll turn our attention to the lovely world of The Witness, a peaceful looking game with brain-bending obstacles that are anything but relaxing. The ultimate goal here is to solve all of the many grid-based puzzles and eventually escape the island. However, while these brain teasers start out relatively easily, with simple mazes to complete and paths to follow, they get complicated quickly. This becomes especially true once the environment itself starts coming into play, forcing the player to use their surroundings in creative ways, either directly or as a hint, in order for the puzzle to actually get completed. There's a lot of potential here to think outside the box, literally looking at things from all angles in order for the solution to come to light, which makes it all the more satisfying when the aha moment finally comes. If that doesn't end up happening though, it is at least open world. So if there's one puzzle that's particularly vexing, you can wander off in another direction and find a different one to get stuck on. Silver linings, I guess. And number 1, Broken Sword, The Shadow of the Templars. All of the games on this list so far may have been brain-bendingly complex, especially the further players get into them, and the more mechanics and complications they introduce. However, few titles have puzzles that become so infamous, even to this day, that they have an entire Wikipedia page devoted to them. That's exactly what happened with the goat puzzle in Broken Sword though, as the ill-tempered animal caused many a player to get stuck for an inordinate amount of time, and potentially even give up, giving it quite the reputation. And it was mainly because it used a different kind of logic than the other puzzles in the game. Protagonist George Stobart has quite the difficult path ahead of him when the game opens, as he tries to track down a cult and unravel a deep conspiracy. But little in this snippet of plot gives away just what a hard time he'll have on his journey. The whole game is full of the kind of point-and-click logic that was standard for the time, which means a lot of players' time was spent poking everything in the environment with everything stashed in their inventory. When you've become that notorious off the back of one puzzle alone though, there's nothing else in the world of gaming that could possibly take the title of most difficult puzzle game of all time.